So, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us at the Garrison Institute Pathways to Planetary Health Forum. I'm Jonathan Rose, the co-founder of the Garrison Institute. Before we begin today's session, let's review a few logistical items about our gathering. We're on a Zoom webinar. Participant audio and video, that means you guys, will remain off for the duration of the webinar. Please direct any questions to the Q&A box, and as we get towards the end of the conversation, we will include those and we'll weave those into the conversation. Also, keep your eyes open on the chat box because we will be posting links as Indy brings up fascinating ideas, work that he's worked on, etc. We'll be bringing up links, so that will be a continually unfolding resource for you. We're recording these sessions, so you will have a chance to review the recordings and pass them on to friends. And also, there's a schedule of upcoming webinars and programs at garrisoninstitute.org. This is an interactive online event and is part of our Pathways to Planetary Health Forum 2024 series, which explores topics like regeneration, earth wisdom, across four pathways: the common good, ecological cultures, regenerative economies, and biodiversity and stewardship. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our guest, Indy Johar. Indy is the co-founder of Dark Matters Labs, which is an award-winning architecture and urban practice of Architecture 00. He's also the founding director of the Open Systems Lab, Seeded Wiki House, which is an open source housing program, Open Desk, which is an open source furniture program, a company. And so he's deeply involved in not only amazing ideas, but their implementation. He's on the advisory board of Future Observatory. He's part of the committee for the London Festival of Architecture. He's a fellow of the London Interdisciplinary School. He's taught and lectured at the University of Bath, TU Berlin, University College London, Princeton, Harvard, MIT, the New School, and is currently professor at RMIT University. So, Indy, welcome to the show.
Delighted to be there. Delighted to be here, Jonathan, with you. I'm honored to be a part of this conversation. Looking forward to it, actually.
Great. So, let's start just by giving the audience some sense of you. You were born in London. Tell us a little bit about your early life and your education, and what led you to reimagine architecture as Dark Matters Labs.
Like everything, I never inspired to be an architect per se. That was not my it wasn't like a calling in life that I was at the age of 12 always dreaming of being an architect. I unfortunately, I was born in London. I had the unfortunate experience of being in New Delhi in 1984 in the middle of the riots and experienced it viscerally. And in the experience of that, I experienced how rapidly we could unleash the inhumanity amongst ourselves at an extraordinary speed. And I also experienced how that was used to create a systemic othering. And the othering actually created a permission of violence and a persistence of violence, which has never gone away, really. And that was a kind of profound experience for me and sort of stuck with me. I ended up coming back to the UK, but actually, as a result of that, there was kind of lots of reactions. Obviously, people became more strident on either side of that debate, but actually there was also a more philosophical challenge for me, which is that, was there another path that wasn't just about creating greater divisibility, but something else? And I suppose from there on in, I became more and more sort of attached to the idea of how do you think about the city and place in a fundamentally different way. And so a lot of the life journey in making, whether it was 00 or more recently Dark Matter Labs, was how do you democratize the making of places? But in that revolution, and in all architectural revolutions, I would argue they're all rooted in how we imagine ourselves as being human. And the reimagination of what it means to be human is always the kind of core transformation point. And so I've been fortunate enough of being on a journey from building the Bristol Urban Beach with people like Melissa Mean, to being part of building the Impact Hub network with people like Jonathan Robinson, to building WikiHouse with people like Alistair Parvin, seeing WikiHouse go global, which is all about open source housing. But what we started to realize was underneath all this stuff, underneath the democratization of making, were the fundamental questions, the kind of dark matter questions of the world. How do we own? What do we think of things like property? Well, how do you convert? How do you deal with warranties? All these, to get an open source house is fine, but to get a mortgage in an open source house requires you to be able to construct warranties, requires you to be able to get rights on land. And what you started to realize was that's where the real challenges were, the kind of invisible forces, or the coding of our capital environments, as Katrina Pastor would say more eloquently than me. And so that was where Dark Matter Labs was born. One of the profound moments for me was also this. We were fortunate enough to be involved in two types of social investment structures. One, doing classic social investments, startups, socially minded startups. And the other one was effectively looking at system-based investment in Delhi, or in Jamshedpur in India. And that was doing a whole, irrigation, sanitation, health, education. It was taking a whole place-based view. And as soon as we did that, we started to realize that the system-based view was the only way you could do real social or system or impact investments, because any other point investment would always spill over vast amounts of value, which was non-capturable, non-organizable. And that sort of changed our mind space, that it was not just capital, it was not just institutions, but the capital structures, which are fundamentally problematic. And then that's unfolded into many other things, but we can dive into that. So it just gives a bit of a broad journey into sort of thinking experiences and doing.
That's fantastic. And so I just want to underscore one thing as a larger frame, which is the symptoms that we're seeing of our current economic, social, cultural, political, governance, bureaucratic system, which are climate change and biodiversity loss and income inequality and increased racism and polarization. Many of us believe that those are actually the outcomes of the system design, that they may not have been the intentions of the system design. In some cases, they may or may not have been, but those are the natural outcomes. And that there's only so much that we can do within this current system to make a better world. That list of things that I described, I think, is what you're calling the dark matter.
Absolutely. And I think I would argue that what we're experiencing are all, exactly as you say, symptoms, and they're symptoms of a worldview. And a worldview that, has been rooted in thousands of years, but probably became a planetary view about 400 years ago, 450 years ago, or sort of in the kind of Newtonian Enlightenment, when we started to organize the world into theories of, firstly, separation. So we separated not only disciplines, but actually saw the world through a theory of objects and objectification, distancing, disentangling, the birth of perspective. All these things were actually mechanisms of separation. The shifting of languages, which have become increasingly noun-orientated, or English is becoming a predominantly noun-orientated framework. And as we start to move all the way to classification theory, and classification theory actually was a powerful tool of actually taking that separation and coding that separation. And once you coded that separation, it created the permission for violence. And that permission for violence was a key part of actually what you would argue is this form of revolution that we're living in. And this worldview then takes root in theories of labor. This worldview takes root in theories of property. This worldview then takes root in theories of the private economy as the root of our economy. And what we're experiencing, and people like Forrest Landry talk about this very eloquently, I think, that actually, if you organize things through a theory of separation and contract will always create asymmetries over time. And they also encourage invisible externalities. And what we're facing is a worldview where we're organizing an asymmetric power, creating a shadow of externalities around us, which are systemically, and systemically, it's driving a situation that is self-terminating. And this would be people like Daniel Schmachtenberger's language, which I think is rather adequate, that we've created a sort of the systemic microviolences, which are now no longer ignorable because we're living in the Anthropocene. And those entanglements now are requiring a systemic phase shift of how we imagine ourselves and our relationship to the planet. And this is why, then opens up another critical paradigm that all of these technologies that I would say socio-legal technologies have been rooted in theories of control. They're rooted in ideologues and ideologies of domination and control as a means of organizing the world. But in complexity, in volatility, in those theories of control can no longer optimize and organize the world. They're no longer sufficient. It's not a moral question. They're no longer sufficient technologies to operate in complexity. And so control as a theory of organizing has reached the end of its viable formation. And even then, that's me ignoring the violence that's inherent in these theories. But so even if we ignore that, it's no longer viable. So if you acknowledge the violence, then it's actually deeply problematic. And then I think that opens up a whole new paradigm of how we start to organize beyond a theory of control as a means of organizing a complex, entangled world. So as you rightly say, I think this is a systemic phase shift in how we imagine ourselves and how we imagine our relationship. It's not about climate breakdown per se.
So I want to wind us back a little bit, and then we're going to go forward. So you said this started with Newton. I actually think it started with the European exceptionalism and the Portuguese and the Spanish, in effect, dividing up the world and conquering it for their own, which is a completely instrumental view. And interestingly, although there's been slavery, we know from 4000 BC is the oldest. We assume it's been longer than that. But it was in the 1400s that we started racial slavery by race. And that all evolved from the church saying, well, you can't enslave Christian people. And the Muslims, who were the slave traders, saying, well, you can't enslave Muslims. So they enslaved the Black Africans because that's who was neither Christian nor Muslim. So the racial, although I'm sure there's been different forms of racism throughout history, but the racial bias, anyway, the racial bias, the idea that the Pope could actually divide up the world between the Spaniards and the Portuguese with no question as to who actually owned it. Those were moments in which most of the cultures in the world had a sense of the commons and the common good. Most of the cultures had land may have been owned by the sovereign, but they were owned for the commons. Now, obviously, they used it for their own, for their own wars and that. But the ideas of individual ownership really got imposed on the world and the diminishment of collective ownership through colonialization. And so your description of Daniel Schmachter calling it micro-violences, there were also macro-violences in this transition. And then you had the philosophical, scientific revolution that came along behind that, and others that then created a worldview, and the economic revolution, which then deeply embedded these biases. And what these biases have done is there's a wonderful psychological term or social psychological term called self-construal, which is how do we see ourselves? And these were cultures, and there still are cultures, indigenous cultures in the world, where people self-construal as part of a whole. And as you said, their language tends to be of verbs. Things are processes and unfolding. And we have created a self-construal in this Western European American culture, which is all about the self-improvement, self-aggrandizement, self-ownership, etc. So before we get into the pathway to the solutions, I'd love for you to talk more about these two different self-construals.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the challenge that we face is yes, it's the individuation of the body, the construction of the individual. I think it's also how we then institutionalize that. And our institutional coding of that reality, the theory of property as a red line boundary, how we constructed property registers, how we've created, I think it then flows all the way through the system. And I think what we're suffering with is that, and this is where I think the challenge becomes much deeper than we often think it's about the inner work. Well, yes, it's the inner work, but it's also the kind of deep codes of our society because they're rooted in classification theory. It's rooted in pretty much everything we see and how we organize the world is they're rooted. That separation is rooted in that modality. So, if, for example, you were to look at a DNA sort of, if you were to get your DNA examined and say, where are you from? Well, they'd say, well, you're this percentage Yugoslav, this percentage German, this percentage X, right? And the reality is, well, that's a kind of misconstruing of reality. The reality would be we've all pretty much come from East Africa, and we're all taking slightly different journeys to wherever we are. Right? So what you can do is talk about the journeys and the time places in certain places, but you certainly can't do divisibility. Now, why I'm saying that is it's a very obvious visual coding to a particular worldview of classification and separation, rather than seeing this as a flow, as a continuum, as a verb orientation. And what that codes is a theory of separation. It codes us into separation, as opposed to coding us as different journeys to similar locations, rooted at perhaps similar beginnings and similar momentary crossovers. So I think one of the big things I really do want to emphasize is that yes, the inner work and the kind of the deep codes of society, and it's everywhere around us, and it's rooted in the worldviews we construct. I mean, so if you take, so I think my colleague Fang has done some really beautiful work where they were working with indigenous Taiwanese sort of custodians, and they, for example, have a very beautiful language where they say if they build a house, they're borrowing the stones from the river with a promise to return back. Now, if you think about that, that is a fundamental different relationship of material economy to one of resources and everything around us. So and this is where I think somebody recently told me, taking permission from something. So even if you're gonna, I don't know, sit on the table, you take permission from the table. And what that was really about was not the permission as we understand it. It was the idea of respect. It was the idea of being in relationship with. And so I suppose I just want to sort of recognize how we've constructed that resource-oriented worldview, how we've instrumentalized each other. The employment contract is largely an extension of slavery, where we allocate our freedoms in return for monetary exchange. We do not have freedom of speech. We give away our freedoms and we are instrumentalized to give them away. It's not just free choice. It's not like we are instrumentalized societally to give them away. So I think that's the part that I would say. And then it's also coded in stuff like, our pronouns, the reality was that less than 40% of us is human DNA. The rest is we are living with a multitude of other organisms. And also in personality types, we are a plurality of personalities coexisting. So, and my brain is not defined here. It's a social construct. It's an interbecoming, and it's a developmental reality. So when you reimagine what it means to be human, you start to also recode all those things around us, whether it's my pronouns, and to everything else around us. So I think this is an extraordinary moment of these sorts of deep transformations that we're in the middle of. And they will reimagine everything about us as we walk forward if we can make it all the way through without self-termination.
So you have gone to a deeper systems level. I'm going to take us a little bit to a surface example just to help the audience, perhaps. So there was a very interesting study that was done when the microlenders who followed Muhammad Yunus, and everybody thought this is the most wonderful thing, when they came to Africa, and they went to women in villages and said, we're going to make you a loan so you can put in drip irrigation or you can improve your agriculture and make more money. And they said, but you have to have title to your land and to guarantee the loan. And this was cases where the land was never owned by family. They had rights of use. The ownership was in the hands of the village, and the village elder was the one who allocated, and it was dynamic and it varied. And all of a sudden, when you said to a woman, well, you can only get this loan if you have a title, And so to get the loan, the woman had title, and it disrupted the whole system, disempowered the village elder, often created enormous family disputes because it wasn't really that woman's land, it was the collective of the family. And so this imposition, that's just to be a really clear example of the imposition of a contemporary Western worldview, even though intended for good, that completely disrupts just a relational system. I want to give you the opposite example, which is in Bhutan, in the highlands. Same thing as in most cultures, the yak raising fields are collectively owned. They're actually owned by the spirits and then allocated by people in different seasons and uses, and allocated by size of yak. So what the Bhutanese land bank has, the land title organization has done, is they've come up with an app, and the two yak herders who have adjacent fields walk the boundary together, each with their phone on, measuring the boundary. And so there's sign of agreement. They go all the way around. If there's different owners, different boundaries, and that is dynamically mapped for a year. And the next year, if the ecology is different, if the herds are different, the relationships are different, the line gets remapped. And so it's recorded, but in a completely dynamic way.
And the financialization of property is even, is a modern phenomena. And the second part that I thought was really interesting is my reading of Muhammad Yunus's sort of work. The magic was not the security based on land or anything like that, was the civic security. It was the allocation to a group and actually the mutual support and the mutual frameworks of accountability. So the accountability wasn't to the capital provider, the accountability was to the town halls together. It was a civic social accountability and security as opposed to a land-based security model. And I think this is where our modern capital structures have really not understood the dynamics that were being played out there in a much more sophisticated sense. And we're actually rooting it on very simple models, as you said, land, and thereby destroying all sorts of custodianship necessities of governing that land. And the other point I would say is that, and this is where the problem becomes really challenging, is that if you're trying to be a custodian, say, of a piece of land, you are governing that land not only for microbiomes, nutrition, biomass, biodiversity, biophilia, water, all sorts of things, but you're governing those carbon, you're governing it in that context, in that situation. And the problem that we've got is our theories of governance for these entangled situational appropriatenesses are not sufficiently able to govern for that entangled situational appropriateness. They can govern for single point outputs. They can govern for profit maximization. They can govern for maybe even carbon with carbon markets. But every time you do single point optimization, you undermine the complexity of the situation. And this is where the re-embodiment and the embodied governance in relationship is vital to dealing with complexity. So this is where abstraction of rights becomes even more challenging. And I think this is where a new worldview starts to become a necessity of operating in complexity.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's talk about some governance. So you're going to start with the boring revolution?
Totally. So I think where that came from was increasingly a frustration that we were obsessed by making new things, but not recognizing that our worldviews were constructed by our bureaucratic systems. And to be really sort of cheesy, I would sort of say that Uber is really a bureaucratic innovation. That's what it is. It's an invention of bureaucracy. And it's about and this is at the kind of normal sense. It's just reinventing bureaucracy. It's a revolution of bureaucracy. It's a matching system. It's an allocation system. It's an institutional framework done digitally. Has lots of issues in it in terms of its governance, because it's still governed by a theory of capital accumulation and rent-seeking systems, which I think is really problematic. But in its essence, is that. The second part is that actually most of our governance theories have been largely born in the 19th century, sort of in Germany, where our theory of governance has been, Wilbur and other have been basically rooted in those frameworks and be rooted of our institutional frameworks have been rooted there. Now, when you add both the entanglements and complexities that we've spoken about earlier and computational capabilities that we're sort of touching, you start to have a more fundamental challenge and an opportunity to be able to actually rethink our theories of bureaucracy and governance, all the way from rights to policies to sort of registries, all the way through. And that becomes really vital as a means of organizing and reorganizing the world. So this is where the boring revolution was to get us to understand back into the dark matter, back into the kind of deep codes of society, to start to say, actually, any meaningful revolution is not just the revolution of the inner self and the outer world, but it's the revolution of this middle institutional framework that codifies the world around us. And if we need to do all three simultaneously. And we often look to imagine the new chocolate bar, and we look to do our own inner work, but we forget to do the middle work. And it's this middle work that's vital, because that's what normalizes the default behaviors of the world around us, the resource allocations, the attention economies, how we objectify each other in our conversations, the nature of the relationships we make, the nature of the contracts we construct. Most of our contract theory is based on some form of violence and self-optimization, as opposed to rooted in foundations of care. So if in a complex entangled world, you have to construct a new theory of relationships rooted in care. And I don't mean a soft theory of care. I mean care in a deep sense. And many great feminist economists have been, and sort of thinkers have been talking about economies of care. And these are fundamentally important in complex entangled realities, because to be in care is to not only understand my relationship to you, but it's also simultaneously important to understand how you view me. So there's two forms of compute: my situational reality, your situational reality to me. But then the third dimension, which is I think where it gets really challenging, is almost the quantum mind. It's the infinite possibilities of our relationships. And at the intersection of those three computes is a consciousness of care. And in entanglements and in complex worlds, that becomes a really base unit of organizing. And I think this is where you start to not only have to re-agentify the world and make it rooted in learning, but you have to re-relate the world in a deep relationship of care, which actually constructs whole new possibilities. So that's where the kind of the boring revolution actually has to sort of start to actively recode those things in the world around us.
And one of the really beautiful examples you once gave me on this was our company's work. My own company's work is often in very low-income communities that have security issues, and we build security systems to help protect our residents. And you reframe that as caring systems instead of security systems. And if you really think of it as a mutual system of reciprocity, in which it enables, or is there to, instead of there to protect people, to separate the good from the bad, if you actually view it as a system that enhances mutual relationality, then it becomes a care system. And it actually does provide a much higher level of security, because one of the things we know is that deeply relational systems are much more resilient, and that highly structured systems that have barriers to them are much more vulnerable.
Absolutely, yeah. And it also creates a fundamentally different theory of technology, because our theory of technology is largely coded through a theory of control. And that's a passive, what I'd call, it's the water it's the water we drink all the time. It's the air we breathe all the time. Everything that we've organized the world in has been rooted in theories of object orientation, control theory, noun theory. And that's how risk is structured, corporate governance is structured. We root things in accumulation of risk and control. If we want to root things in a relationship of care, that would invite us to write technology, write data holding, write a whole new theory of governance of technology in a different format. And it would create a different theory of democracy. So, whether we talk about surveillance capitalism or sort of surveillance states, this would create a pathway for a third path in our theory of technology. And I think this is where it's really important that communities like ours should be thinking about how we're coding the next generation of LLMs. I think it's communities like ours should be advancing the next generation of moving us away from surveillance technologies to actually new care technologies. And we need to be allocating capital to reinvent to these technologies at root and code level. And I think this is a really key opportunity. So this is my key plea. You've, Jonathan, built an amazing community of people that are starting to think very profoundly about the world and their relationship in the world. And I'm saying, let's also now recode that world to that worldview and re-technologize it, that world to that worldview. And then I think we can start to construct a different pathway.
So let's go there. So I just want to set the table a little bit. So the first thing is the Garrison Institute, is all the people on the call listening in, many of you know that our work is deeply grounded in contemplation and contemplative wisdom. And one of your key pieces of advice is that if the entire world meditated, prayed, and was compassionate, that still wouldn't solve the problem, because we have the institutional infrastructure, the dark matter that's working against us. And so if we're going to talk about, and there's a lot of talk in the whole new paradigm world about systems level change, you actually have to apply a new kind of thinking to every part, a new relational thinking to every part of the currently isolating systems. Okay, Dan Siegel, who's a Garrison Institute board member, on reflecting on quantum theory, and there's a wonderful book by Karen, I forgot her last name, Karen O'Brien, Deanna says, is quantum social change. And in that is this idea of the pure plane of possibility. That since quantum is all about relationships and probabilities, that actually at every moment we actually have the freedom to reconstruct the system if we choose. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about, because to many people, the system seems so structured and closed and oppressive or unchangeable, or so let's talk about this pure plane of possibility and where you see the thin places, the cracks in which we can change it.
Yeah, no, so I'll respond to that on multiple levels. Level one is that what we're talking about here, for me, is not even a moral debate anymore. It's an efficacy debate. I want to move us away from this being a moral position. I increasingly believe this is the only way to organize in complexity at the scale of entanglements that we're operating at. This is the only way to organize, right? So, and I think this is kind of, and I would invite other people to tell me how I'm wrong so I can get that right. Because my intuition, and certainly the research that we've done, says that in this level of complexity, there's no other information pathway for control as a theory of organizing. This is not possible. It requires infinite compute to be able to resolve control as a theory of organizing. So it's a really genuinely, this was the kind of the big thing between sort of communism versus capitalism. It was a compute problem. Fundamentally, it was a compute problem. The market would always outcompute any form of collective predictive systems. And even now, I think this is going to be one of the biggest challenges. So first thing, there's a kind of, this is not a moral argument anymore. This is fundamentally an argument of a new theory of efficacy. Two, I think it's also rooted in the science of this stuff is extraordinarily far more advanced than actually are, maybe for the last close to 50 years, maybe 60 years, the science is already there. So whether it's David Bohm, like there's extraordinary thinkers who've already charted the route for us. You could, Jonathan, you could list out many more. So this is not a science problem anymore. The third dimension is, I think the cracks in the system are, we are living in a self-terminating moment where effectively the scale of risk that we're accruing at a societal level that's now visible means that actually pathways to a transition are becoming very critical. And so I think there's increasingly, I would say if we were having this conversation 6 months ago, I would be what I would call lunch might be entertainment in a conversation for many CEOs. It's God, so interesting to have you talk, Indy. And now the conversation is less "I'm lunch," but more like, "Oh, shall we come to a meeting?" Because I think people can see the risk profiles that are coming up in front of us. Then I think the final point I'd say is that also these worlds are there are very interesting landscapes where these crises are converging to create new windows, new shatterings of the Overton window. Whether it is the work that people like Jane Engel and Pam are doing in Nova Scotia and in Halifax, looking at how land becomes self-sovereign with the friendship centres to actually reimagine how the Crown and Indigenous worldviews come together to construct a new legal possibility. Or whether, I would argue we're going to see a round of monetary innovation in the African continent as we start to see the breakdown of current monetary systems. We're going to see a round of resource-based monies being reinvented in the African continent. So we're going to see vast amounts of monetary innovation over the next period. And those monetary innovations are going to open up radical new pathways. Increasingly, if I'm talking to investors or allocators, some of the biggest farms in the world and sort of farming, intergenerational farming owners, they're saying, look, our soil is systemically degraded. Our cost of securing that land is becoming progressively high, and we can't recruit the labor. And they're saying their theory of extractive asset management fundamentally doesn't work because they're starting to see the escalating costs. So they're now starting to talk about quite openly about, well, what does flourishing asset management look like when we create positive entangled spillover effects as inherent to the asset management, not as a gift, not as a PR stunt, but inherent to asset management. So what we're seeing is those worlds, those risks, and this is where I think the unusual alliances are starting to emerge, is the risks are now being perceived and are not discountable. And at the same time, risk holders are starting to be able to be erudite about them. And those conversations about why is soil not an asset? Soil's not even an asset. Right. So the tree canopies of a city are not assets, they're costs and liabilities. The collective intelligence of a city is not even an asset. So it doesn't exist, but it's probably the fundamental asset of a place. The material balance sheets of the cities, when we acknowledge our embodied carbon footprints and our embodied carbon banks that we've constructed, are not even acknowledged. So we are about to see a massive transformation of where value lies and the arbitrage between where value lies and where value is currently priced, as well as these conflicts of these new tension spaces where these new worlds are colliding. And this is why, for me, it's really important that we hold the new, what I call rights of nature and the future of nature economy with the new technology economy, with the new, what I'd call post-labor economy, beyond labor economies, as well as effectively starting to imagine new pathways of organizing into those frameworks. And those are all available to us. So I think there's a comprehensive moment that we're in the middle of. And the revolution that we've been talking about as an internal scientific worldview is now starting to be required, understood into those strategic risk holders. And I'll just end on this point that I think the four unusual alliances that I think are starting to emerge are the hints of, and these are genuinely unusual for me. One is central banks, because central banks are starting to perceive systemic risks in a way that actually, and financial stability risk, and Delilah, I think, is here. She can talk eruditely about this, but I think there is a real perception among central banks about the stability risks that we're holding. Two, security services. Security services that understand security not as a red line boundary, because no nation state can red line boundary survive the Amazon dying. We're all dead. So you start to see security from an entangled perspective. And security being energy, water, food systems, the whole stack. So it's not defense, it's the system view of security. And then you start to see communities on the ground. When you talk to communities on the ground that are viscerally seeing these risks come into their lives, they are viscerally feeling what I would say the entrapment of their lives. They're viscerally feeling energy, food prices, nutrition quality. They can feel this. And, one of the most shocking things, I remember an 89-year-old gentleman walked up to me after a talk I gave on streets in Birmingham. He walked up to me and said, Indy, I didn't understand everything you said, but you put words to what I was feeling. So communities on the ground get it. And then finally, intergenerational wealth families. Families that hold wealth over time understand this because actually they're starting to see risk outside how we code risk in our current accounting and normative frameworks. So I think there's a whole new alliance possible that I think is really extraordinary and necessary to be able to hold some of this stuff.
Fantastic. Willie, will you put the links to the Life Ennobling Economies in the chat now? And Indy, I want to spend like 5 or 6 minutes talking about that, and then I actually want to move on to your amazing mapping project of the European built economy, the housing map, because what that does is it actually reveals it's not the full vision, but it reveals what I would call as how the transition is beginning to emerge. So let's talk about life ennobling economies first.
Sure. And again, this has been done with Emily Harris, who's been leading on this with me. And what this has been coming out of, we were part of building, looking at how do you finance tree canopies of cities, all the way through to river systems, to self-sovereign energy meters, to self-sovereign care cameras. What started to become evident to us was that there is one, and this obviously riffs off the brilliant work of Ruth Wilmore Gilson, because actually the work of life-affirming infrastructures, which recognizes how we've constructed our economies through theories of control and punishment. And actually, if we want to unleash the full capacity of actually all of life, we have to have a different theory of organizing and unfurling. And people like, I can't remember his name, from the Santa Fe Institute, Jason Possibles.
You know what? Just insert, and we'll repost the list because it'll show up for the new arrival. So you mean Stuart Kaufman, or?
That's right. Yes, exactly. Stuart Kaufman to Jason Possibles.
By the way, there's a list of amazing thinkers that your work draws from. And by the way, one of them is Kate Raworth, who's actually on this call with us. Another one, by the way, who's not named, but is John Fullerton, who's also listening to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. John, Kate. I mean, there's so many brilliant individuals, and I think that this list will grow as we're going to be reaching out to many of you as well to come and be part of these conversations. Because, so where I was getting to was that I think first thing is moving away from theories of control. And the kind of anecdote I use is capitalism and socialism are both still rooted in theories of control. The only difference is one is about individual control, the other one's about collective control. And if we want to break the paradigm of control, we're going to have to move into a paradigm of learning. And learning and care as the rooting mechanism of organizing change and organizing our capabilities. And that means that you have to organize the world through ennoblement and building our capacity to be radically more human, radically more in relationship, radically the freedom to be radically, the freedom to be in care, the freedom to be radically human, not to just construct choices. So that was one leg of the conversation. And many of you, I'd love comments. Emily and I would love comments on this paper, because I think it's the second part of this was actually expanding the theory of life, obviously, which has been many people have actually talked about this, to not just human-centric and not just non-human, but also the machine component. And I do this intentionally, and I think it causes friction, and I acknowledge the friction. But I think it is really critical as we start to enter a cusp of a new conversation where we can not only create what I would call, we've gone from the age of creating tools to simplistic machines to generative learning machines. As we start to herald a new age of sort of automated capacity of machines, that we start to look at how we construct a machine economy through a theory of ennoblement and a theory of unfurling, a theory of nurturing and care, as opposed to instruction and weaponization. And I think this is something really going to be critical for us as we enter the future. So the next part of this was to actually say, how do we construct an economic conversation that puts the amazing people that have been talking about the abolitionist work, which is really vital to be able to actually create deep justice, to actually bring together the nature rights conversation and the self-sovereignties of nature conversation, to bring together the kind of technologist conversations of their stories, bring together the beyond labor
instrumentalized economies together to start to talk about a different a new political economy for a new economic thesis. And I think this becomes really vital because you start to see they're rooted in very interesting behaviors. And what we've wrote out in there, that this worldview requires us to reimagine stuff like theories of property, reimagine theories like labor, our theories of governance, centralized governance, our theories of the private contract as a means of organizing. The basic building blocks of the constructed world have to be recoded. And I think this is where, just referencing back, I think our bureaucratic capabilities start to give us a pathway to be able to organize into that future. And I think that is becoming incredibly beautiful and interesting. And, whether there's work that we're doing about how do you build a new theory of how do you build a river bank, a river which is able to create claims into the future based on the ecological benefits that it generates. So you can start to not only build ideas of self-sovereignty, but new theories of resource, new theories of unfurlment, new theories of entanglement rooted in that distribution of agency. And I think this opens, and this is why we started this conversation. And, we listed a whole amazing bunch of people, and we will carry on adding to the list as we do interviews and conversations with people. Because I think for us, this is a conversation that needs to unfurl and be developed and be added to and challenged. But we think it offers a different frame for us to actually open up a conversation that gets us out of this constant lock-in. Well, if you don't like capitalism, then we know socialism doesn't work. And you think, well, hold it. Maybe there's another way. And that was the kind of interesting conversation for us. And, and to be really straight, we've also been rooting this in our organization. We're not rooted to a theory of control. We're not organized through a theory of the CEO. We're rooted to a theory of organizing through a framework of learning. Our pay structure is not based on hierarchies of power. We've changed our pay structure to be able to change that. So we've started to deploy this in organizational forms. And I think if you're going to build the next human economy, you have to reimagine the organizational form fit for this, because the next human economy is not going to be sufficiently able to be driven by a theory of control to deal with either the complexity or the care or the creativity or the complex cognition that's required for the next economy. So this is, again, an efficacy argument for operating in this next entangled worldview in a machine-assisted landscape as well.
So two thoughts, which is, when in doubt, think like an ecology. So an ecosystem is a total co-evolving, distributed. In effect, it's not even distributed. Control is even not a relevant word. It's co-evolving, co-affecting, continually adapting. And so I think that's the model you're talking about. You mentioned technology, and earlier when you said LLM, just to translate to those that don't know, that means the large language model. And these are the basis of AI these days. And what's really interesting is that AI draws from all the crap in the internet. It draws from everything in the internet, and what's in the internet is almost all created from the worldview of the colonial and control and the current economic system and Newtonian world. So it is almost impossible to get the right answer out of that. But if you take your reading list, it has people like Kate and Daniel Schmackenberger and Friedhof Capra, and Daniel Christian-Wall, Katerina Pistor, Ian McGilchrist, Tim Jackson, Nora Bateson, Eleanor Ostrom, etc. E.F. Schumacher, Thich Nhat Hanh. And if we actually infused a large language model only with that kind of thinking, and then asked it to help us co-create this entangled, emergent, co-relational process, verb-based versus noun-based model, it might be able to help us integrate at the speed and scale that we need to deal with the problems ahead of us.
Exactly. And this is my deep request to this community, that we need to code the technologies to scaffold our future. We cannot leave the technologies to effectively a theory of control, because exactly as you say, 97% of the nurturing of our next generation technologies is rooted in 19th century thinking structures, which are then going to replicate through the passive air that we breathe, the passive language that we organize, the dominance of those frameworks. And this is why it's really critical that we start to actually be actively involved in the casting of new class of these capabilities. And I think this is a really important issue for me. I think that there's a danger that we let that go.
Right. And so that's actually a huge responsibility for us. The other thing, by the way, is remember, Meta, Google, all the big companies, Amazon, they have one function, which is to capture our data so that they and others can sell us more things. Their model is entirely about trying to control our attention to be able to treat us as consumers. And so, and no matter what they say or how generous they think they're going to be, that is the framework of their worldview. And so,
and it's rooted in the theory of the organization. It's rooted in the 19th or 17th theories framework of the organization, and where risk is held, where power is asset. The root purpose of these offerings is to make the company smarter, not the users. Right? It's rooted in a very particular function, and I think that's where we are. Absolutely right.
So, what are the lessons from your mapping of organizations that are doing new housing throughout Europe?
So,
and Willie, can
yeah.
you bring up it's called the European Built Economy Mapping of Organizations, and put that in the chat. Okay.
Absolutely. And I think there's a few things that I'm going to say which I think are going to be slightly controversial, but I think they're important to us to recognize. The big thing that we're learning is that all of Europe can afford to build 144,000 homes a year if it was to live within the Paris Accord. 144,000 homes. Britain alone is committing to doing 350,000 homes a year. All of Europe can do 144,000. So, number one, we do not have the embodied carbon capacity to look at our theory of how we've created justice in the housing market through new provision is actually no longer available to us. Systemic constraints. Second, so this is really important for us to recognize, because I think this constraint landscape, we as endless consumers have never recognized the system level constraints, and those system level constraints are coming into us. Second, I think what we're going to have to do to be able to respond to the constraint is reimagine our thesis of how comfort is constructed. What is our thesis of comfort? Do we create comfort through ever thicker, ever heavily more insulated buildings, or do we create comfort by wearing warmer jackets? How do we construct comfort? What is our theory of comfort? And we're going to have to do it in two different ways. Obviously, the microviolences of light, CO2 levels in buildings has a massive violence effect on actually our cognitive and emotional capabilities. So both those things. Third thing is we're going to have to start to re-operationalize our buildings. So if we have got limited embodied carbon capacities and material capacities, we're going to have to operationalize our buildings in much more efficient ways. We're going to have to construct our theory of buildings to be aprogrammatic or programmable buildings, programmable environments. Remember, an average school is 17% utilization rate. The average school, 17%. That means that matter is lying empty and wasted for, 83% of the time? And I think when we look at how we've constructed our economy of systemic waste, I think we're going to have to really radically imagine reoperationalizing our building. Third, we're going to have to start to think much more deeply, like I was talking about. Most of our asset codes and our asset classes of buildings are focused on single-use category A offices, locked into design. We're going to have to make our buildings more durable. We have to make our buildings more deconstructable. We're going to have to build the biomaterial base of our buildings. We have to rebuild the biomaterial economy around our landscapes to be able to construct that circular environments. And then we're going to have to build the new asset classes and codes to be able to actually reinforce those frameworks. We're going to have to build the new theory of balance sheets of our built environments. So we're seeing quite a systemic shift in that landscape of what that future looks like if you just follow the constraint landscapes. And I think one of the big challenges for us is that most people are not yet seeing the system level constraints that's available to us. So all of our dreams of the future are being constructed on infinite supplies of copper. And yes, there is more than enough copper in the world. The problem is in the next 10 years, we don't have that supply because actually it takes 10 years to open up a mine. And 80% of our ecological destruction is done by actual through mining. And we know we're going to see a 600% increase in mining at the global level in the next 25 years, because just what that journey is going to be. And at the same time, our food systems are becoming systemically more fragile. So when you look at our land use environments, if we're going to build a biomaterial economy, which we're going to have to do, we're going to have to do significant land transitions to be able to shift our land, to be able to not only, to be focused on plant-based food systems. And as our agriculture and arable land becomes more fragile, we're going to have to move towards controlled food environments as well as rewilded food environments. We're going to have to move towards agroforestry to be able to build the biomaterial economy. So we are looking at a real, if the Industrial Revolution cast and recast our countryside everywhere, it's that order of transformation that we're facing. And the constraints are going to shift the innovation spaces. They're going to shift everything around us. So what we've been doing as part of that, and also a piece of work around the European Bauhaus economy, and also a piece of work that we're just about to release, is really getting into some of the details about what these transitions start to manifest like, and then how do we deliver some of the justices that are actually a critical necessity. Because before the environmental tipping points will kill us, almost certainly all of us, it's almost certain that the social tipping points will actually hit us first. So actually, the justice issue is first and paramount to making this a transition. And the choice that we're facing is a fork in the road between mutually assured thriving or mutually assured destruction. There is no other middle path, just because of the availability of weapons of mass destruction and the decentralized production of those weapons of mass destruction. So we're facing a really interesting fork in humanity's future, but a really powerful fork to an extraordinary possible pathway. And if I gave you the choice of mutually assured destruction or mutually assured thriving, it's not really much of a choice. And that makes it really interesting, because it isn't really a choice. There's a path. And that path is extraordinary, because that path opens us up to quite an extraordinary possible future, which I think heralds us being able to create a new class of planetary organism. People like James Lovelock write about the first third of the Novacene, where the planet becomes conscious and we're operating in a completely different way. So we're living in a beautiful fork where there really is only one choice.
And that, I think, is our end. There's a bunch of questions, but we've come to the end of our time, and you brought it to a beautiful, beautiful ending. So, wow, Indy, thank you so much for this conversation. I want to have another one with you. To really just keep going with these ideas, but this really is the systems change and the worldview change, the relational change that is at the heart of the work that the Garrison Institute, but it's the work of what the world must do to have a more viable future. So this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much. And thank you to the audience for joining us. Our forums are offered free of charge, and we love it when people donate. So feel free to go to garrisoninstitute.org and click on the play button. Become a look at our calendar for full offerings of future programs. And we look forward, as the Beatles said, you're such a lovely audience. We'd like to take you home with us, and we'd love for you to return with us. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan, for doing this. And it's been a real pleasure and honor to be part of this. And thank you for everything you're building as part of this conversation. So, and my final point is just, if I said anything wrong, please forgive me to the audience, as also please help me get better as well. So all welcome, all inputs are genuinely welcome. I put my email address up, so feel free to get in touch. Yeah, all errors and corrections more than welcome.
Fantastic. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.